talk about China's economy because China has been making strides despite the worsening geopolitical tensions. China dominates, for example, the area of robotics. And recently, U.S. government just passed a ban on Chinese humanoid robots and quadruped robots, and this is the area where China has like 90% of the world's market. Why do you think U.S. is doing that?
97% of the market, as I understand it. Look, I think the US is doing it in a preemptive attempt to create the conditions for the emergence of a domestic industry. If Chinese manufactured robots take hold and secure large market share in the US, there would be very little room in the domestic market for indigenous robotics businesses to grow. So I think it's a preemptive move from the US's point of view. I thought it was funny, by the way, because that announcement from the US was, from memory, around the 27th, 28th of July. And about 10 days later, China announced that it was going to slap a whole bunch of tariffs on American pecans. It tells us something about the structure of the two economies now, doesn't it? China's idea of a trade response to the Americans is to stop the flow of pecans. Whereas the Americans are putting up barriers to the latest generation of humanoid robots. Pecans versus robots. Who are the peasants today, I guess, is the question. Anyway, it's an odd.
Well, that was due to the U.S. Deliberate U.S. government policy, right? Because U.S. has banned export of more advanced semiconductors to China. So the only thing they allow China to purchase from US are agricultural products. So today, the export to United States looks like the export of a third world country to more advanced manufacturing economies because US exports soybeans. Well, that's a separate problem when China shift the purchasing of soybean to Brazil. But soybeans, corn, these consist of the largest U.S. export to China, whereas China exports everything from advanced machinery to Labubu, and it's but it's not that because U.S. product cannot compete. It's the U.S. government says, no, NVIDIA, you cannot export your most advanced AI chips to China. No, these U.S. All these so-called dual-use items cannot be exported to China. And so, what's there to buy? And this is also reason why China has shifted a lot of its dollar surplus to the global South countries to invest in infrastructure because they cannot use those dollars to buy actual American products they want. Sorry, you were going to say something.
Well, I was just going to mention that there's actually a report in today's South China Morning Post, which reports on the findings of a recent survey of companies conducted in July by the US-China Business Council. And it found, and I'll just quote from it, that most of the pending export licenses are for items that are already available. So these are export licenses that American companies have to apply to the American government for so that they can export to China. And most of these licenses are for items that are, quote, already available in China from Chinese or international suppliers, effectively sidelining American companies for no strategic gain. Months-long licensing delays are costing the United States billions of dollars in exports and eroding American market share globally, says the survey. So this is an example of where shooting yourself in the foot actually starts to become very, very material. And there is quite clearly not much to be gained. And yet this is what the administration is now trying to, force onto American companies. They're going to hurt American industry by doing this. So what that's just what it is. The other thing is that overnight there was also a report in the Wall Street Journal of all places talking about the dramatic growth in Chinese exports of machinery and equipment. It's almost like it takes them 6 months to 12 months to catch up with what's going on, right? But at some point or another, the mainstream Western media ends up reporting on things that many of us have been watching and talking about for, 2 years or 3 years. But the realization, I think, is coming that China is exporting a lot more than just, cheap shirts and cheap jocks. They're exporting actually things like machinery, equipment, robotics, etc., to the global south. And it totally undermines another piece of propaganda that's been floating around for the last month, that somehow China is, quote, pulling up the ladder of development from global south countries. China is actually enabling global south countries to develop quicker by building more rungs on a ladder through the exportation of equipment, technologies, machinery, solar, you name it, right? So that's the changing configurations of the contours of the world. And now, so the Chinese economy, let's very quickly touch on that. You mentioned it. It's actually okay. Broadly speaking, it's not pending collapse. We've discussed this before. A recent speech made by a very prominent, well-known public economist, Li Daokui, received a lot of a frisson of excitement, mainly from Western commentators, I might add, who saw in Li's speech an affirmation of all of their own gripes and complaints about the Chinese economy. And they picked up on the idea that that Li used to describe the Chinese economy as being cold. Okay, that it really needed to be warmed up. The growth drivers to replace the property sector hadn't emerged. That there was constrictions as a result of local government debt. And so that these Westerners latched onto that and said, "Aha! See, here it is. Even Chinese economists know that it's all going to pot." But of course, that's not what Li said at all. And in fact, I think that there are elements of his assessment which are pretty spot on, but I think that there are some that are a little bit undercooked. The local government debt issue is an issue, but it's not because of solvency problems. And again, people get confused about this. They think that, local governments owe money, they're going to go broke. No, local governments basically exist in what we call a vertical fiscal imbalance, structural problem. They have very few revenue raising opportunities, but they also have the greatest expenditure responsibilities. Okay. And so much of what they get by way of revenue actually comes by way of federal or national government allocations. And that structural imbalance has been the case for a very, very long time. No local government's going to go broke, right? But it means that they do have cash flow constraints. And because they've got cash flow constraints, they have been slow to pay bills. And that has rolling effects, of course, locally, because it affects cash flow. Economic systems are fundamentally about flow. So Li's broad observations that the economy is a bit cold talks largely about whether or not there's enough aggregate demand. So he argues that the national government needs to spend more money, boost fiscal injections, etc., etc. My own sense is that, in fact, that's not really quite the problem. The problem is actually blockages in flow. There's plenty of monetary resources in the economic system writ large, but we're not getting the cash flow that's actually necessary to make the system turn over a little bit quicker. Velocity of circulation of money is actually quite slow in China, and it needs to be increased. Right? You don't need to inject net any more financial resource into the economy other than what's planned to support new infrastructure development, etc., etc. What you've got to do is get dormant money capital moving a little bit more effectively. So I think that there's some of the challenges. I do, however, think that the Chinese government's also very mindful of these challenges. So they're tackling things like age receivables. Sounds pretty boring, right? But it's essentially companies in supply chains that are not paying their bills for 60, 90, 120 days. They're clamping down on that. We're going to see the emergence of a more sophisticated and mature market for supply chain finance solutions. one of the most undeveloped areas of financial product or services currently in the Chinese economy writ large. That's going to be buttressed by People's Bank of China institutional reform around product developments, enabling the mobilization of household and enterprise savings into structured financial products to support precisely these sorts of things. In other words, to boost circulation, get money out of savings accounts and pump that money into supply chain financing so that companies are not sitting on unpaid invoices for 60, 90 days, but are paying them after 30 days. We're also going to start to see, I think, a progressive acceleration of the folding up of so-called zombie companies. Now, some of that, about 40% of zombie companies, is actually a legacy of the deleveraging of the property sector. But I think we're going to see a lot more activity around that. Now, that's going to be an interesting transformational process, because as you basically shut down zombie companies, you're going to need to also facilitate employment restructuring along the way. So we're going to see how successful different parts of the country are in making that next transition, right? That structural transformation. So I think that the main challenge in the Chinese economy isn't that there's a lack of money capital floating around the system. The challenge in the Chinese economy, if we want to keep talking about headwinds, is actually about circulation flow. The exports is contributing about 18% of GDP growth, so it's actually a minority. So again, public perception, widespread, is that the Chinese economy is export dependent. Well, it's not. Over 80% of GDP growth is actually driven by domestic demand, investment demand, and consumption demand. 18% is from net exports. So, keep it in perspective. Continual upgrading is happening, and I think we're going to continue to see that as well. And that's likely to, over the next 6 months, see some growth again, I would expect, in fixed asset investment. So fixed asset investment fell in the last 6 months, even taking out real estate investment. So this is broadly speaking in factories and equipment and things. Though, once again, when you drill down to the next level, you'll see that fixed investment actually grew in certain sectors, whether it was in 3D printing, for example, and other high-tech areas. So we're seeing a restructuring of the Chinese economy continue to take place. Lastly, and this is kind of it's a bit in-house, if you will, but as you'll remember, a lot of complaints were made by sort of Western observers about, overcapacity and involution. The restrictions on the growth of fixed asset investment is actually one of the obvious ways in which the nationalist government and its financial apparatuses have sought to clamp down on the expansion of capacity. It was actually a direct response to concerns about involution. And so people who complained about involution 6 months ago are now complaining about the fact that fixed asset investment has been constrained. Right? You can't have the both. Fixed asset investment was constrained to deal with involution. So that's where I think the Chinese economy is going. A couple of other quick things on that front. And they go to the 5-year plan, right? 2026 to 2030 5-year plans. There's a whole bunch of really interesting things happening in terms of creating a new energy system. So heavy emphasis on renewable energy, green hydrogen, and other green fuels, right? Green ammonia and other green liquid fuels. That is going to be, I think, part of the big story of the Chinese economic system over the next 5 to 10 years, is the ongoing evolution to reduce its dependency on fossil fuels and to increase the role of renewable energies. The second one that I think people will, sorry, I'm just getting over a cold, that people will find interesting to keep an eye on is the emphasis on urban renewal. Urban renewal is an upgrading of urban systems. So we had the property deleveraging. And that obviously has had a big impact. the next phase of urban development in China is actually going to be all around urban renewal. New infrastructure, cleaning up, resorted to my Anji Bai Cha. So this is what they call a white tea, but as you know, it's actually a green tea. Anyway, the urban renewal will see reinvestments to upgrade infrastructure like sewage systems and all of that. So a whole bunch of the developments that took place in China, between say 1980 onwards, means that today something about 16% of the dwelling stock in China is now more than 40 years old. And a lot of that dwelling stock was probably designed to have a life of between 50 and 70 years. So there's a whole bunch of dwelling stock together with the infrastructure that supports it, drains and electrical wires and all of that, that are actually coming up to a point where they need to be replaced and renewed. That's going to happen. We're going to see a whole bunch of these old buildings, I think, torn down, and people move into some of the newer ones, and some new buildings get built in their place. But we're not just going to see a like-for-like replacement. We're going to see, I think, a new phase of urban settlement patterns that will have a lot more emphasis on public space and public utility. And you've probably seen a bit of this already on your bike rides around Shanghai and stuff, where urban renewal is actually creating neighborhoods that are a lot greener, a lot more open spaces, a lot more parkland, as well as a whole bunch of public services infrastructure, whether it's some of those amazing libraries that we see as part of the encouraging people to read campaigns, and other kinds of public amenities. So we're going to see a lot of that over the next 5 to 10 years, transforming urban environments that were a little bit brutalist, okay, not in a strict architectural sense, but a little bit brutal. Things got built very, very fast, to things that are now a lot more sensitive to the ecology, cleaning up rivers. I mean, again, you've ridden along the Huangpu River, and also the Suzhou Creek, I'm guessing, right?
Zhangjiabang, yeah, it's a canal that a tributary of the Huangpu River.
So all of that's cleaning up, right? And there's going to be more that will be done. The cleaning up of urban waterways. You think back 10, 15 years ago, these waterways were basically the dumping ground for factories and other things, right? They weren't assets other than as places, for barges to carry things, and as dumping grounds of pollution and rubbish and things. Well, they're all getting cleaned up, and that's going to be transformational. So I'm actually incredibly excited about, as you can probably tell, far more excited about this phase of Chinese urbanization than I am about the sort of last 20 years of urbanization, which moved a whole lot of people into cities, generated a massive amount of economic growth, but in a sense did so without necessarily delivering a high quality urban living environment. Now we're going to move down that path. And I think anybody who's interested in urban settlement and urban development and ecologically sensitive urban development would be well advised to pay close attention to what China is doing and thinking about in this space, because about 65% of China's population is urbanized. The target is about 85%, right? Which is another 120, 130 million people to be urbanized over the next 20 years. And so this is quite an exciting period to be engaged in an ongoing transformation and development of this incredibly large and complicated place.
Yeah, I right now I am in Shanghai. I'm in a hotel in Pudong. I've been bicycling around all the greenways, and so I saw firsthand the effort of the urban renewal in Shanghai, and it's very nice. A lot of the river and canal has been cleaned up, and now like the the neighborhood and community are flourishing. And I suspect that Shanghai is a pioneer in this urban renewal project. Because Pudong is relatively new. It's a lot of the infrastructure are pretty new. I suspect the same kind of rollout will happen gradually in other Chinese city as well, because this is how Chinese government, central government functions. They first experiment in selected cities, like what they did with special economic zones in the early 80s. They tried introduce market reform in Shenzhen, in Shanghai, and a couple other cities. When that became a success, they then propagated that model nationwide. So I look forward to see more of these urban renewal projects getting rolled out throughout the country. Right now, I living in Shanghai. It's very nice. It's I highly recommend people to visit. If it's your first time visiting China, I would suggest Shanghai as your entry point, because it's clean, it's very tourist friendly, and the infrastructure is just excellent. And anecdotally, I also has been talking with people in retail, because yesterday I went to get a tailor-made suit, and I was asking the shop owner, who has been running the shop for over 20 years. She said, yes, the business was slow after COVID compared to pre-COVID time, but at least for her own business, the business has been picking up this year compared to the last few years. So it's getting better. Now the
Well,
economy is definitely on a recovery path. Go ahead, sorry.
well, and it's actually quite an interesting dimension of retailing, right? So we're starting to come off the back of COVID. I think it's taken, in some ways, a bit longer than people expected for new behaviours to re-emerge, right? Because after the disruptions, 2.5 years of disruptions as a result of the pandemic, a whole bunch of new behaviours got locked in, and new ones are emerging. And some of those are in the way that people essentially spend. By and large, in most main cities in China, the material conditions of life are reasonably good for most people. In other words, people are not short of the basic fundamentals of having a normal, half decent life. And so they're now starting to explore other possibilities. And those other possibilities will be things like, other than travel and education and those sorts of entertainment things, they will be things like bespoke tailoring. Right. So I wouldn't be surprised to, over the next, again, 5 to 10 years, where we'll see a little bit more of that. I used to get my suits made in Shanghai too, and also shirts. So shirts and suits, and I used to take large groups of people actually into many of these places, and we'd order, in the end, collectively probably 200 shirts. Most of my Australian friends would order a whole bunch of interesting business shirts, checks and stripes and all of that. And finally, they get around to me, and I'd order 5 white shirts and 5 blue shirts, and that was me, right? But yeah, look, I think that these services-oriented things will actually redevelop a place in the heart of people, right? We'll go from the mass consumerism stuff. We'll go from the big brand names, and people will actually move towards, once again, some of these bespoke tailoring. So it'll be, again, very interesting to watch these transformations take place.
Yeah, they offer excellent quality for the price. You can't beat it. They also ship globally. They actually do ship all over the world, to Germany, Canada, Australia, etc., which is great.
I'll get the details with you on another occasion.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Warwick Powell, for making your time to speak to us. If people want to follow you, where would they go?
They can find me at my Substack, warwickpowell.substack.com, and they can check out my book, Thermoeconomics in a Time of Monsters, which is available on Amazon.
Thank you very much. And for my audience, thank you for listening. Until next time. Bye-bye.